Slavery ended in 1865, or at least we're made to think it did. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's been long on my mind and is pretty deep cutting, so sit back, try to relax, grab yourself a drink, and we're going to try to answer that question of, is slavery still alive here today in the United States in 2025? Short answer, no. Long answer, well, it's complicated. Let's get into it. So, topic that I'm touching on today is going to be, well, to say the least, is going to be pretty heart-wrenching and emotional for a lot of us. So, if you're one of those people or you have a really gut-wrenching feeling about something that I say or some of the research that I provide, please feel free to contact me, reach out to me. I'm not trying to upset anybody by this or get anybody upset or riled up, but I'm just trying to produce some facts and not only that, have a conversation about some ideas that may or may not sit well with a lot of people. So without any further ado, without any further rambling, let's get into the topic of slavery. Now, before I get way too deep into this, I do want to say from the outset, I'm not trying to compare the lives that we live today here in 2025 and compare it directly to slavery. That being said, when you talk about something like sex slavery or some of the incarceration stuff that we're going to talk about later today, you can make a direct comparison, and specifically for things like sex slavery. Now, I'm not going to be talking too much about that topic today. Really, I think this will be it. That in and of itself deserves its own show. So we'll save that for another day. But I do want to make mention that, again, not trying to direct compare or say that we are slaves or a certain set of our population is still slaves today. Although you could caveat that and say maybe that's actually closer to the truth than we want to admit. Now, with that out of the way, let's take a little bit of a look back on what the institution of slavery was in the United States and kind of around the world before we hit on what's going on today. So, for a little bit of historical context, slavery did not start in the United States. I take a gander that most of you already knew that, but if you didn't, slavery's been around forever. And the reason that it was around in most cases was that group of people that was enslaved, generally speaking, was a part of a conquered tribe or set of peoples that was taken over by the government, which you may have existed, or may have been an indebted class that sold themselves to slavery because they may not have been able to pay their debts. That carrying over into the Americas, slavery existed. A lot of people want to point out that 1619 was the beginning. A lot of people actually, I remember there was a whole project, and it doesn't get too much flack nowadays, but there was a whole project called the 1619 Project trying to claim that America actually started in 1619, and that is because that is when the first slave ship came. Now, there's a little bit of an issue with that, and the issue there being that realistically, slavery existed here in what we call the United States, or in the British colonies as they really were at that time, or possibly Spanish colonies, Dutch colonies. Slavery existed well before 1619, actually, and if you want to include indentured servitude, which you can make arguments for and against, I'm not going to try to get in the middle of that argument there today, but you can make points that it had existed. Slavery as an institution had existed long before 1619, and it really did come along with the birth of the United States. And if you are one of those people, or if you've heard people point out the inconsistencies, especially with a document of something like the Declaration of Independence that stated that all men are created equal, and there's kind of a untold but in there, but the slaves, there's some condescending attitude there and some real hypocrisy that comes along with making a statement as bold as all men are created equal. Meanwhile, the person who wrote that owned slaves. So with those contradictions that were ingrained into the United States as early as 1619, as that's documented, however, like I already mentioned, it was here before, but realistically, as the United States became its own country, from the founding of our country, slavery was an institution that had to be dealt with. And for years, for decades actually, the United States fought within itself, and when I say the United States, really the people of power and the powers that be, fought amongst themselves over this issue of slavery. And how it was to really see itself through, because there was obvious contradictions in something like a Declaration of Independence, or looking even further down the line at something like the excuse me at something like the Constitution of the United States, that even part of it had to make clear the other persons, because those other persons in the slave states, as we call them now, those other persons needed to, in their minds, be counted towards population when it came to setting how many delegates were going to be allotted to a certain state, how many representatives were going to be in a certain state, and what the actual population at the end of the day was of a certain state. And of course, if you remember this from history class, this was called the Three-Fifths Compromise. Yeah, so as you can see, you look back, I'm not trying to give a total history lesson here, but I think it's important to understand slavery as an institution existed in the United States from our beginning. From our beginning as a country, and getting that out took a lot of time. And something that you might not know was that the person who we all credit with getting rid of slavery was not in favor at the outset, and I'm of course talking about Abraham Lincoln, was not in favor at the outset of abolition, of getting rid of slavery. What he was, of course, actually intending when getting elected in 1860 was to actually disallow the continuance of allowing new states that came into the Union to be slave states. So to essentially stop it in its tracks. Now, that of course started a civil war that we go back to and love to point out. But like I said, it's kind of important to denote that that wasn't actually the intention at the outset, and abolition was actually a movement, although it did have, as the Republican Party started up, which was in fact started before Abraham Lincoln was elected. They just had not had a president elected yet. But as the Republican Party started to come to fruition, and through the guise of other people underneath Abraham Lincoln as the president of the United States, abolition became more of a necessity in terms of, well, finalizing the plan after the war had been won. So emancipation happens 1865. I think a lot of us know that. If you don't know that, you're probably not American, and I'm not trying to slight you for that. I'm just saying that is a pretty well-known date by Americans. But what's not so well known is that we were not equal people for quite some time, and some even argue that we're still not equal people, and I will kind of make that argument as the show goes on. Now, civil rights movement that came to fruition with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that brought things a lot closer in terms of the races. And when I'm talking about the races, you're talking about strictly white and black, and you're not talking about, you're not talking about those groups of Europeans that came over and drove something like the Irish, who went through their own trials and tribulations, or the Italians. Today you see a lot of Hispanic Americans. Hispanic, I don't even know if is the right term. Central Americans, South Americans coming up and dealing with a lot of the same issues that I would say those Irish and Italian Americans went through in their own time. But the difference with Black Americans was that from the outset, of course, you had slavery, and then you had the institution that really kind of sat behind the curtains for a while, even after the emancipation of 1865. So when we look at it today and what we're seeing as a difference today, I already mentioned that sex slavery exists. And when it came down to it, if there are many examples of maybe someone, a female who was seen as attractive by a slave owner, well, they would be taken in as what they like to call it a concubine, but a sex slave, for all intents and purposes, a sex slave. And realistically, if you're comparing that today, you actually have direct comparison, and that exists all over the world. There are sex slaves in every country, as we unfortunately find out annually, with another story or two popping up, someone like a Jeffrey Epstein coming up. But even more sinister than that, people that prey, well, he is as sinister as it comes, being as though he also inflicted his evils on minors. But there are people that really do make sex slaves out of, minors, people who have no agency, and people who really have no ability to fight back or to get themselves out of it. And this is a major problem, but I don't want to make the whole show about this, but I think there is a direct comparison there where we could say that slavery absolutely exists to a certain degree. Now, another point that I definitely want to make here is, before I get into really the crux of my argument today, what I really want to make clear to you guys is that the The big issue in my eyes, something that I've always grown up with, contented with, come in and out of favor with, was realizing the impact that something like incarceration has on a population. Now, incarceration statistics are gruesome. When you're going to go and look at those, if you are to go look at those, what you will find is a massive disparity when it comes to just the races. Now, I'm not trying to make an argument that these people did or did not do what they are supposed to have done. However, I think we all know at least a case or two where someone was tried and convicted for something that they had no part in. As you see a lot of pardons coming out, especially during the first Trump presidency, you saw a lot of pardons for people who were proven to not have done what they were supposed to have done, at least not to the level that they were written up and charged for, but they remained in jail either because they did not have the representation that was required. Maybe they were caught in a snafu. Maybe there was a little hitch or something wrong outside of what they were originally convicted on, and that's why they remained in jail, prison. And yeah, so one of the biggest is that we still have people that are imprisoned today for marijuana charges, whereas many states now are legalizing marijuana, or at least decriminalizing it, or making sentences much less harsh than they have been in the past. And yet we still see people who are incarcerated at felon level for marijuana. And being as though this is the topic that touches home for me, at least for a while, I was a pretty avid, I would say, marijuana user, and at this point, I have pretty much cut it out of my life, and I cannot be more thankful for doing so. But that being said, I believe after being as though I personally partook in the activity, I don't see any difference between marijuana use and alcohol, and actually, in many cases, I would much rather prefer that I'm dealing with someone on marijuana than I would be dealing with an alcoholic. And so I think the government's lack of understanding when it comes to something like that really can be extrapolated out to a lot of different issues that we see when it comes to incarceration in general. So I want to bring up a couple of statistics before I get into the programs. And when I talk about the programs, I'm talking about incentive programs. And again, I'll get into that in a little bit. When it comes to racial disparity in terms of incarceration, now, something that you should know is that Black Americans make up about 13% of the population, which is interesting because Black Americans have made up about 13% of the population for the entirety of the United States. Haven't gone up, haven't gone down. Um, and to me, that's a fascinating fact in and of itself, but that's probably a topic for another day. Now, when we talk about incarceration, 13% of the population, talk about Black Americans, make up about 37% of felons, of prisoners. Now, that means that, and if you look at the white population, we make up about the same amount, about 34, 36% of all prison inmates. And when you look at it at a rate of per 100,000, it's actually 5 times more likely that, and this is Black males, not Black females, mind you, but you're about 5 times more likely as a Black male to be imprisoned than you are as a white male. Now, again, I'm not trying to get into the did they do what they're supposed to have done. I'm not trying to get into that argument. I'm just laying out the statistics of pure numbers of how many people exist in these prison cells. Now, when it comes to actual prosecution bias, these are all just light statistics. You can go look these up and prove me wrong or right. I really implore you to do so. That way you actually become smarter and I become smarter in the process. Prosecutorial biases are everywhere, whether this be due to lack of representation, whether this be due to racism, a combination of the two. I'm not here to judge that. I'm just laying out the facts here. Black defendants are hit with the mandatory minimum 65% more often. Plea deals are, in terms of favorability, they hit whites with about an increase of 21% in comparison to blacks. And drug arrests, 29% of all arrests in terms of drugs are Black. Now, when you look at especially the drug use and drug distribution, there are a lot of studies that have been done that have actually proven that use rate or distribution rate in a lot of cases is actually very similar. And it is just about either being caught, being prosecuted fully, receiving a plea deal. So to see a disparity of that much, where you're seeing 13% of the population making up well over 2 times the amount of their population share in terms of arrests on something like drugs, should be eye-opening. Now, we'll get into some bigger disparities later that I think are a little bit more eye-opening, but When it comes to incarceration, I think it's really important to understand that a lot of these people have, in a way, had their lives taken from them, their freedom taken away from them, and they no longer have agency. What I mean by that is felons are no longer allowed to vote. They are not hired nearly at the same rate as someone who has never been convicted of a felon charge or been imprisoned. And when it comes to that, you are seriously talking about affecting someone's livelihood and the outcome of their life, the possibility of them actually getting to a higher stage in life, getting up from where they started. And when you talk about rolling over the amount of disparity that we're talking about here over generations, well, you could see how a problem might emerge where we see today. Like I said, the massive disparity in incarceration. And not only that, just getting arrested. When it comes down to it, you could make an argument that a lot of this has to do with class. Now, some of the research that I came up with says that 70% of inmates actually earned under $15,000 a year before their arrest. Realistically, when you look at it that way, low income and poverty really does feed these systems. And whether you talk about prisons, jail cells, realistically, almost all of these people are coming from poverty. That being said, when you look at the average rate of income or the average wealth that we'll talk about in a little bit, it's pretty obvious to see who that discourages the most and why it might be, thrown around that even though we may have gotten rid of the chains, slavery still exists. Now, a good point to be made is that if you're going to be if you're going to be comparing slavery as it was before the emancipation and what some might term slavery today, slavery before emancipation was one of control, was one of physical control. Whereas slavery of today, or what some may call slavery, what I'm going to term is not quite slavery, but is a different kind of thing, is more of a background form of control, and it kind of a way of tethering the individual to the government, whether that be talking about imprisonment or talking about a agency or a program to help lower income individuals, which I want to start to get into now. When you talk about federal assistance programs, and these range from talking about the food stamp program, the SNAP, the federal aid housing or housing assistance, whether you're talking about something like Medicaid or insurance assistance, when you're talking about something like these three, and these three are going to be my examples for today, it really is a way to tie someone to the government and not allow that person to escape. Now, of course, these programs are utilized by many as a stepping stone, and I'm not trying to take away from that, and I'm not trying to say that that doesn't exist, because it absolutely 100% does. However, when you're talking about something like housing, and we'll get into the numbers here in a second, or you're talking about something like insurance and the amount of people who just may never get off of it, well, if that actually ends up being the case, is that program actually helpful, or is it just keeping that person in that low income bracket and never allowing that person to ever build wealth for themselves like we claim that the American dream is made for them? So as we get into these programs, let's talk first a little bit about a SNAP program. So SNAP program is one of the things that the Trump administration through the DOGE department is trying to attack. And whether you like it or not, what they're trying to do, or what is claimed to be being taken advantage, and I might have actually misspoke there. I don't think they're necessarily going after it through DOGE. I believe that actually the recently confirmed health secretary, which is RFK Jr., I believe he's actually going after this by way of trying to disallow essentially shitty foods from being able to be purchased by SNAP purchasers, by food stamps. And for this, I think that we can have an argument about this. And I do want to bring up a point here. It's not like SNAP recipients don't have other income or other money to purchase food with. SNAP is supposed to be an assistance program, not the end all be all of someone's subsistence when it comes to food and drink. And I think that actually the government has a responsibility to disallow really shitty foods. And when I say shitty foods, I'm talking about low calorie, high fat, low protein, and low carb meals, or super high carb drinks, something like sodas, something like other soft drinks that contain extremely high sugar amounts. I think the government actually has a duty to remove those from the program in terms of if you're going to be using this program of the SNAP to subside and actually survive. I don't think that you, and this is my opinion here, but I do not think that you should be using this government assistance to make yourself a less healthy person and really make yourself a possible real burden on society. And I don't mean that in a terrible way, but I do mean for the fact that if you are constantly requiring super sugary foods, you could become a diabetic. If you're already on the SNAP program, you possibly could be a part of Medicaid as well. There's a good chance. If you're in that low income bracket, you're receiving all of this help federally, and the whole cycle is just feeding you into health problems, low income, staying down, not being able to get yourself out of that hole. And if you ever do, you're going to have health problems. Then I don't think the program is doing its job. So I do think it's a duty in terms of the SNAP program and what they're trying to do, what allegedly they're trying to do, I will say. I do think that is a duty of the government. Now, let's talk about SNAP recipients and a little bit of facts when it comes to it. One of the things that might actually happen is that you might have an individual, let's say that she's a single mother, and we'll say that she's in that bracket where she actually is entitled to SNAP. She's entitled to actually live in Section 8 housing or low income housing, and is also a recipient of Medicaid. If that single mother is to receive a pay increase of $5,000, maybe a little bit more, she may lose over $1,000 in benefits included in all those programs per month. So $5,000, increasing your wage by $5,000, $6,000 over a year, you're now going to be responsible for thousands of dollars of increased cost because you're now removed from eligibility from these programs. Now, if you factor that math out, if you're not doing it in your head, what that could equate to is somewhere in the ballpark of $12,000 to $15,000 in increased costs. And I do not know one singular tax benefit that actually saves you that much money per year. The honest reality is that person would be better off staying at a low income. And if they get a pay raise, leaving that job and going and getting another low paying job to remain in the beneficiary area. And for that is all I could say is that is ass backwards when it comes to policy, and it's not looking at the entirety of the picture. When it comes to who is actually receiving these benefits, Black Americans, again, about 13.5% of the United States, are receiving 25% of SNAP benefits. And if you're not going to do quick math there, it's almost double of their population share. Section 8 housing is 44% of Black recipients and 21% of Medicaid. The big one that I want to talk about there is Section 8 housing. Now, I don't know if I have a little personal anecdote here that I'm going to throw in. I don't know if this was Section 8 housing technically, because it's my belief, and I could be completely wrong, so I'd love for you guys to let me know here. Section 8 housing, if I'm not mistaken, is rent-controlled housing. I don't know if that is cost-controlled housing where you're able to buy, where you're able to own. So I do not know. But I do know that a lot of the principles remain the same, and I'll explain why. So I want to say maybe during COVID, this might have been the year after COVID, year after COVID hit, I should say, maybe in 2021. So we're going about 4 years ago now. I went out and I've been searching up and down things like Zillow, other rental places, or places where you could buy homes. And I've been up and down these things looking for an opportunity to get out of the house. And one of these random properties pops up for $105,000. And if you know the area that I live in here in New Jersey, it's a very expensive area to live. $100,000 house is unheard of. I was blown away. So I set up a meeting. There was no mention of it being cost controlled or being low income on the listing. It didn't make any sense to me. So I went toward the area. It was a condo. But this condo was cost controlled, and it was for low-income individuals. When I went, I spoke to the agent. It didn't take me a minute to understand that I was not going to be eligible for this, but the person was adamant, oh, maybe you are eligible, here are the income requirements, and immediately I knew I could not qualify. And the reason being is you had to be earning, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong here, back at that time, I believe you had to be earning less than $33,000, $34,000 a year as an individual, as a family, somewhere less than $38,000, $40,000 a year. Now, the problem with this house, when you actually look into it, which I did at the moment because I was very stunned, is that this housing cannot go up in value, I believe, by more than 1 or 2% per year. That's the control part. The other control part is if you do actually expand upon your income and you get out of the bracket of that $33,000, $34,000 for an individual or $40,000 as a couple, if you get out of that bracket, you have to sell the house. You cannot sell the house for a profit. You cannot sell it to someone who wants to pay market value. You have to sell it underneath the cost control program. So in essence, what it is a rent control. And you're not able to build wealth. It's not a wealth building tool. And as many of us know, one of the best ways to build wealth in the United States and really across the world is real estate. And realistically, what it was taking the idea of real estate and dumbing it really far down and making it a kind of stupid exercise, in my opinion. Now, how that would make sense, I can't really do the math on it. These people would have to be earning somewhere in the ballpark between about $33,000 and $40,000 a year, and would have had to save up because the program was not accepting anything less than the 20% down payment. Would have to save up somewhere in the ballpark of 20 grand, and I had a hard enough time doing that as I was at my income. I can't imagine someone at that level being able to provide for themselves housing, food, and still be able to come up with $20,000 saved. So at the end of the day, what that program was aiming at, I cannot really fathom. But then I think back, and as I'm doing this research today, it really kind of clicked in my head that, you know, Section 8 housing, something like that, really a tool that I believe the government uses in order to keep people, and maybe inadvertently, it may not be on purpose 100%, but maybe it is. And I believe that it's a tool being used to keep people down and keep people in that low income field. Because again, you are never going to be able to build wealth through that. You are never going to be able to step up, sell that house, and utilize it as a stepping stone to a larger house or something that's more accommodating to your family. You're going to be stuck at that, and you're going to have to sell it at the same rate that you essentially bought it for, really damn close. It's not going to be inflation adjusted, which we will talk a little bit more about later. You're essentially just paying rent. And you might be getting a little bit of money. Maybe you can call it a forced savings account, maybe. But at the end of the day, you're going to be paying enough interest on that it's actually eating away at your money if you have a mortgage on it and you didn't pay outright cash, which just wouldn't make any sense. Something that is also kind of lopped in there that I didn't talk too much about is Medicaid, or United States government assisted insurance. And this is just lumped together. Again, I kind of want to put these three together: SNAP, Section 8 housing, or cost controlled housing, and Medicaid. If you are part of all three of these, that little anecdote I told about the single mother here at the beginning of this section, if you are a part of all three of these programs, and they do have different incomes thresholds that you need to meet in order to qualify. But at the end of the day, it's somewhere between 5 and 8,000 between the three of them where you are no longer able to benefit. And if that's the case, and you get a raise or you get a better job, and all of a sudden you're making what the minimum might be, maybe $40,000, and you're no longer qualified to own one of these or to participate in the beneficiary of these, well, now you're out on your ass and you have expenses through the roof, which are going to be related to inflation. So that's where I want to talk about the middle class here and how the middle class is getting hammered. And realistically, you can make an argument that the middle class today has been rotted away because in order to be middle class nowadays, a lot of people make an argument you got to be earning over $100,000 as an individual, let alone a family, to be middle class. And if that's the case, you could just see how much has eaten in. There were a lot of people as I grew up even, and we're only going back like 15, 20 years. A lot of people who looked at something like an $80,000, $90,000 salary as a great salary, and you can live off that. Nowadays, you look at the cost of insurance, you look at the cost of housing, the cost of food, and I am mostly talking about the tri-state area that I live in, to be fair, but this can also be applied to areas like Florida and the populated areas, places like Texas that have blown up, and of course, California. When you look at all of these areas, you have to be earning more than $100,000 to survive as an individual. And if you're talking about a family, my goodness, you must be earning more than 125, 150,000, or you're not going to survive, let alone have a house to call your own, have a roof over your head, have food in every single belly every night. You are going to need to be making a lot of them. And a lot of what this has to deal with is inflation at the end of the day. When you talk about inflation, just in the last 6 years, since 2019, we're looking at a 20% inflation boost. 20% inflation over a 5 or 6 year period is devastating. what they like to say the target inflation rate, which is bullshit, let me just say. The target inflation rate by our government standard allegedly is 2% per year. What that means is that if they actually achieve that, the inflation rate would allow you to put your money in a savings account, generally speaking, a savings account in a bank, not have to invest in stocks, and you would still have your money grow past the rate of inflation. Let's just be honest with ourselves, folks. If we're going to break that down, a 20% increase in inflation over what we're going to call a 5-year period, because 2025 is not really that far underway. If we're being honest with ourselves, a 4% increase every single year, and I think that's taking things lightly. If we're looking at the cost of, well, eggs nowadays might be a little bit of a funky one because of the bird flu and culling of the chickens, as people are going out and saying now. But the cost of milk, just the cost of meat, the cost of housing, for God's sake, in New Jersey, where I live, the average cost of housing has gone up almost 100% since 2017. We are going from an average rent price of about $1,000 to almost $2,000 now across the entirety of the state of New Jersey for average rent. With that being the case, I mean, let's be honest with ourselves, wages are not keeping up with that. It doesn't matter what kind of minimum wage increase you're seeing, where actually in New Jersey over that same time, I want to say that we saw an increase in minimum wage from somewhere around $10 to $12 up to what is now 15 or 15.50. Well, something that goes into that is the fact that everything gets more expensive as minimum wage goes up. Reason being is you're going to pay that McDonald's worker, the Starbucks barista, you're going to pay that person working at a Qdoba, at a Chipotle, you're going to have to pay them what was almost double the rate. I remember when I was a kid, my first job that I got, I want to say that I was earning either $7.25 or $7.75. No, it was $7.25 for sure. When I was a kid, my first job was $7.25 when I first got hired by my company that I still work for today, mind you. $7.25 per hour. And since that time, since I was 14, which should be over 11 years, the minimum wage has more than doubled. That is pretty bizarre, to say the least. Going off of that and understanding that, of course, things are going to get more expensive, that kind of gets price factored into inflation. Yeah, of course, rates of pay have gone up, but the inflation has far outpaced those increases in pay. And for that reason, when you start talking about taking someone's income before they ever touch it, like I mentioned in the last episode, before they ever touch it, their income is having 30%. If you're in that $50,000 to $105,000 bracket, I believe, somewhere around 30% of your income is getting taken away before you ever get to touch a penny. How do you make things meet? How do you make ends meet? That is a real question. And in my opinion, it is another way of control because you do not have, and control, of course, I'm talking about from the people above, the people that want to make our laws and then tell us how much to pay them, and they vote on their own salaries every year. They want to tell us how to live. And it is really becoming increasingly difficult for, as I already mentioned, the lower income individuals, and specifically if you want to talk about Black Americans in the United States and how much they make up these groups of people that participate in these benefits, it has made life really tough to make that step up. Like I said before, the American dream, of course, is to start from rags and go to riches, right? Be able to pass on that nest egg to your kids. Well, that nest egg is getting eaten alive nowadays in the United States, and a lot of it is due to inflation. Another thing that is really tough, especially if you're living outside of my area, like I mentioned, yeah, minimum wage has gone up, so has the price of things. But across the nation, somewhere like a neighboring state for us, like Pennsylvania, I don't think that the minimum wage has gone up. I believe that they're still at the federal minimum, which I believe is still, I'll go check this right now. Minimum wage, if I'm not mistaken, is still at $7.25. Let me just check that. That it is. Has not raised since 2009. That's incredible. So, given that a state just next to mine, again, we're in New Jersey here, we have a 15 minimum wage, I believe. And you want to talk about a state right next to us being $7.25. It's not like the cost of living across Pennsylvania. There may be parts where cost of living is significantly lower. Somewhere like Pittsburgh, I can't imagine. Philadelphia, definitely not. Somewhere where like I have some cousins living, a lot of people that very close to up near. My goodness, am I going to forget where this is? Near somewhere like Milford, Pennsylvania. $7.25 is not going to get you very far at all. And it is it's kind of insane to think about. Now, again, am I the type of person who thinks that increasing the minimum wage actually helps? Well, if you were listening close enough, as I was saying, it increased the cost of goods automatically and the cost of service definitely as you raise the minimum wage. So I'm actually of the opinion that raising the minimum wage really doesn't do much at all. It might actually expedite inflation, but that's neither here nor there. The point being is that wage increases and in wage increases in general, even the raises that you're going to receive from your company, are not outpacing the inflation that we're seeing nowadays, and that's one of the biggest problems that we all see. Now, another thing that has been required as we see this inflation come in and really hit us, and tax increases over time, one of the biggest problems that we see, of course, is the amount of hours that we need to work and cutting into that leisure time. And I will point back to one of those documents that we talked about before. One of the biggest factors of being an American was the right as a human being. Granted, when this right was established, slavery still was a thing. However, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if we're going to keep seeing the hours jump up, and the statistic that I found, which I'm not sure is too accurate, I can guarantee you that there's a disparity between men and women here. And I do not have those numbers in front of me, so I'm not going to act like I do. But the average work week has risen since 1979 from 38.8 hours all the way up to 40.2. That means that the average person is working some overtime every single week. The whole point of a 40-hour work week was so that you have those 2 days of leisure. And I think taking that away from people and constantly talking about the rates of depression, the rates of anxiety, they're going through the roof. And it's not going to help Americans to continue to see our hours worked per week continue to climb every single year. Realistically, I think that's what you're seeing. You're seeing more and more people either working multiple jobs, trying to get overtime at their current job. And at the end of the day, I'll be honest with you, like I wouldn't be able to do this podcast without leisure time because this is my leisure time. I do this for you guys. That being said, I love it. And really, it does make me happy to continue to do this. But if I had to work 50, 55, 60 hours every single week, which sometimes I do, but I do that out of the goodness of my heart and being able to help the company that I work for when I'm asked. I don't do that out of necessity. And if I had to do that every single week in and week out, I don't know if I would have the energy to do something like this. And I'm sure a lot of you are in that position where you are forced to work multiple hours that you do not want to be working, but otherwise you would not be able to make ends meet. Realistically, I think we're heading into a cycle here where if, for example, I want to close the show out with this. The Doge is allegedly going to be trying to send out a check for $5,000 to each American, each taxpaying American, for the money that they saved. Great. How much better would that money be spent on a national? How much better would that money be put into use for investments into the future of the United States? I, for one, I mean, I'll take a $5,000 check, but what I see in that is those inflationary COVID payments or the unemployment payments that everybody got that I never got to see, which still to this day pisses me off. But I see the same thing coming, where as soon as we saw those payments, the prices of everything went through the roof. So who's to say after we get this $5,000 check, the prices of everything don't go through the roof? How about reinvest that money back into the future of the United States? How about invest that into some infrastructure? How about invest that into our education of our youth? I just think there's so many better uses of this money than to give us a blank check, because at the end of the day, I am fearful that the price of everything else is going to go up, and those prices don't go down. You remember for a while during that, I believe it was during Biden's presidency, but I'm sure many said it during Trump's presidency as well, that the inflation is transitory. What the fuck does that even mean? When have you ever seen prices go up in general and come back down? Except for gas. Gas is a fluctuating item, so I don't want to lump that in. But when you talk about everything else, when have you ever seen the price of meat go down? When have you ever seen the price of milk go down? Eggs, this is going to be a real question here as we come out of this bird flu epidemic and the rate of the population of chickens gets bumped back up to what it was. Are the price of eggs going to come back down, or is it still going to be $8 for a carton of eggs? Because it's a serious question to ask, realistically, and I am quite fearful of it. To totally close this one out, do I think, just to answer back to my original question, do I think that slavery exists today in the same way as it did before? When I say before, I'm talking about 1865. pre-1865? My answer is going to be no. Still going to have a caveat there, though. And if you weren't catching it all along the show, I will caveat it again. There's still sex slavery all across the world, let alone the United States. And we will have to have an episode about that because it is an epidemic that is feasting on our youth. It is sending our young girls into drug addiction, into abuse, and killing them. And that is pure slavery. When someone does not have full agency, when someone may or may not be making decisions under duress, under states of mind that they're not fully controlling themselves or their decision making, that is full on slavery. So, in a way, for certain people, slavery certainly exists. Are there people who are participating in incarceration and doing labor for prisons at massively low rates of pay? Yes. Yes, that absolutely exists. And you can definitely make an argument for that being slavery. Although there's a significant portion of those individuals who made decisions that were poor decisions that put them in prison. So maybe that's not quite the same, but I think at the end of the day, we can admit that maybe we're not slaves, but we are certainly being taken advantage of our government. And I think that it is very, very important for us to recognize just how dire the situation is getting, especially in an area like mine where costs have gone through the roof. And I know for a lot of you individuals out there, you may be from the same area, you're probably feeling the exact same way. And if you're one of those individuals that I mentioned earlier, and you definitely don't have to be black, trust me, to be participating in something like a SNAP program, something like a housing assistance program, something like a Medicaid. If you're one of those individuals, I pray for you. And I hope that everybody else here is praying for you because that is a tough thing to get out of. There's a significant amount of you who will get out of it after a year. I believe it's around 70%. There's a significant amount of you that will get out of it after 2 years, which I believe is somewhere around 78 to 85%. There's still that really significant block of people. We're talking about millions of people still that do not get off of that program after 2, 3, 4 years, or possibly ever. And if that's the case, if you're being held down and you're not able to create wealth for you, your family, your future generations, I think it's time that we make a change here in America. Sal Assante with We The Patriots Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this show today. And if you did not get a glimpse at it, go take a look at our 100th episode special. I talked about a lot of fun things while I may have had a drink or two, and I think you will enjoy it. I will catch you hopefully next week. I might be going away, and if that's the case, I'll catch you guys when I get back.
I wish I were the fucking state. I wanna be something, not nothing. Trapped inside my dream and I'm running away from these demons. But the feeling's so good, I'ma keep dreaming.